Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, this Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. I wanted to jump this week into some comments from the new Bank of Canada Governor, Tiff Macklem, obviously keeping interest rates on hold at the lower bound of 0.25%. But I think he made some interesting comments in regards to the future of interest rates and the future direction, or at least their thought process over at the Bank of Canada, which I have illuminated to in the past because these guys are incredibly predictable. But one of the reporters during the interview asked Tiff what his one message to Canadian households would be. What was the one thing that he wanted Canadian households to take away from everything that the Bank of Canada is doing today? So let's clip that now.
Our message to Canadians is that interest rates are very low and they're going to be there for a long time. We recognize that Canadian businesses are facing an unusual amount of uncertainty. And so we have been unusually clear about the future path for interest rates. If you've got a mortgage, or if you're considering to make a major purchase, or you're a business and you're considering making an investment, you can be confident that interest rates will be low for a long time.
So this guy basically, I think irresponsibly really, comes out and obviously is encouraging Canadians who already have the record amount of household indebtedness in the G7, over 100% of GDP, private debt to GDP in Canada is squarely in the danger zone, over 250% of debt to GDP, so one of the most indebted countries in the G20. So basically encouraging Canadians and businesses to go out there and borrow more money. This is called forward guidance, and basically what this is basically them signaling to the markets. They're trying to encourage behavior. They're trying to nudge behavior in the direction that they want, which is to go out there and to borrow money, and they're basically signaling that interest rates will remain low at zero basically for the foreseeable future over the next several years, and basically they are fully committed to quantitative easing right now, $5 billion per week of purchases. I mean, again, you have to contextualize all of this. Without the Bank of Canada's intervention, mortgage rates would probably be at 5 or 6% today, not the 2% that you're seeing today. So these guys heavily influence markets, and I think that what they're doing is they're basically giving people forward guidance to go and speculate on real estate. Again, if you suppress yields, if you suppress interest rates and you eliminate the bond market, you eliminate price discovery, because that's all interest rates are. It's just a measure of risk. So if you remove that measure of risk, i.e. you have zero or negative interest rates, you remove the risk pricing mechanism. So this is basically, again, just a green light for Canadians to go and speculate and lever up on real estate, because let's call a spade a spade. There is no Canadians out there don't necessarily get all hyped up about investing going long the TSX. Most Canadians talk about owning multiple rental properties and as a way to build wealth. So we aren't gung-ho about the stock market and the TSX. When Canadians go to invest and they go to speculate, they go to real estate, obviously, which has been in a bull market for 20 years that has been heavily supported and subsidized by policymakers. So I think it's important to contextualize all that, and the willingness of these individuals, these central bankers, to go down the path they're going. Actually, in a follow-up interview with Bloomberg, Tiff Macklem also signaled, as I have been talking about in these videos, that their intentions to highly consider yield curve control is very much on the table. Let's link to that clip now.
What might that look like? I mean, you've said, I mean, and obviously you were there in 08, 09. We didn't get into quantitative easing then. We're there now. The bank's balance sheet is expanding. It'll continue to do so. What would the next step look like, or a different step of accommodation look like?
Well, we discussed, and we have a variety of exceptional monetary policy tools. We're using LSAPs, or quantitative easing. Those programs can be scaled. our balance sheet has expanded rapidly, but it's still relatively modest when you compare it to some other major central banks. There is certainly scope. We've used forward guidance today. There are other types of tools like yield curve control that some central banks are using, like Australia and Japan, and we're certainly looking at their experience. So, as I said, if we have to do more, we have the capacity and we will do more.
So let's unpack this. So essentially what this guy is willing to do, essentially what they're basically telling you they're going to do, is monetary policy is going to get ever more egregious, whatever the bond market will essentially allow them to do. But they are basically going to essentially a version of MMT where the government is going to dole out fiscal spending checks, issues of government bonds, and the Bank of Canada is essentially just going to soap up all those bonds and essentially monetize that debt. That's basically the path that we're on. So what happens here is essentially under yield curve control is they are going to pin rates to the floor. So in other words, if yields start picking up because investors get nervous and they think inflation's around the corner, the Bank of Canada just basically increases the amount of QE that they're willing to take on and basically puts a ceiling on how much they will allow interest rates to increase. Again, you can certainly not a free market capitalist society, but this is kind of the era that we are in today. So one of the scenarios that I look at, again, I think my view hasn't changed in the fact of the next 12 to 18 months, the risk to the downside, for example, for Canadian real estate is significant. But to look at this forward guidance and suggest that these guys aren't going to pump and provide a floor under the market, what they're basically going to do is, let's unpack this. So you have rates pinned at zero, yield curve control, so they're not going to allow mortgage rates essentially or yields to basically normalize, because the cost of servicing that debt would destroy an economy. And so what they're going to do is they're going to pin rates, and they're going to allow inflation essentially to run hot, and they're going to basically inflate away the debt. So essentially, societies, this has happened hundreds of times before. You look at any sort of debt crisis or any sort of situation that we kind of see our situations, that we're in today, is essentially what's going to happen is these guys, you have two options as a society. You can to deal with debt. So you can either allow a debt deleveraging, which is deflationary, which is very, very, very painful. That's think about the Great Depression. So these crushing debt burdens are basically allowed to clear, and that creates deflation, which means basically that your debts stay the same, but everything else is falling in price. Your wages are falling in price, et cetera, et cetera. So that makes the debt more difficult to service. So that's a debt deflationary environment. Again, every government in almost all of history has tried to avoid that scenario. So the scenario number two is to inflate away the debt, which is basically to devalue the currency. So that debt will it will stay the same, but it's being repaid back in a devalued currency where, for example, a can of soup is $20. So it's a devalued currency, and I think that this is basically what they're telling you. That's the path that they're going to take, is basically unlimited QE, pin yields to the floor, and let inflation run hot, because inflation is already a terrible metric to begin with. These central banks are running off of a CPI, Consumer Price Index, which they suggest over the past decade has basically been sub 2%. So they're basically telling you that inflation has been below 2%. They haven't been able to hit their target. But if you ask any real person day to day, the average citizen what inflation is, they'll tell you it's much, much higher than 2%, because the basket of goods that they're measuring is heavily manipulated, i.e. the cost of rent, the cost of buying a home, the cost of your groceries, the cost of, at least in the US, healthcare, for example, it is running probably in the double digits. So you have for a lot of people, you have rampant inflation where wages are not able to keep up. The cost of living is increasing well beyond 2%. But so what happens is if inflation starts to run hot, they just kind of tweak these CPI measures, how they measure the basket, which they're actually already doing. And then they pin yields to the floor and basically let inflation run hot. So it's a very, very slippery slope, but I think unfortunately that's the slope that we're going down. Hence my bullish view in the long run on real assets such as gold and such as real estate. But don't get me wrong, yes, there will be some volatility in the short run, but I think volatility is the entire era that we're going into over the next decade. I'm extremely bullish on volatility. I think if you look at the extensive nature that we're willing to engage in monetary policy is going to be a reverse impact as well on government policy measures. So you're going to have, I think you're going to blow massive wealth inequality. People that own assets are going to be fine because we're inflating the value of assets. We're devaluing the currency as these assets rise in real, at least in nominal terms. And so you're going to create this massive wealth divide. Basically, those that own real assets will be able to probably keep up, and those that don't will get left behind. So you have this growing wealth inequality, and that is going to spur more social unrest and more aggressive policy measures from all levels of government. I was actually just reading today as well that apparently CMHC is actually looking into they're funding a study. I believe they were spending $250,000 funding a study to look at potentially bringing in a tax on your principal residence in Canada. Certainly not a tax that I think is going to be favorable when you have 69% of people who own a home. But I think because the CMHC's thought process is they're trying to look at the wealth inequality and seeing if bringing in a tax on your principal residence is going to help mitigate that buffer between those who own a home or real estate and those who are renting. But again, I think this is just the era that we're going to be going into is just going to be massively, a lot of social unrest, a lot of really fringe, aggressive policy measures are being brought in as we devalue this currency at an unprecedented pace. And I think Tiff Macklem's comments really just highlight the really concerning and extensive nature that these individuals are willing to go to really continue to support the existing monetary framework that we have in place. So something to keep in mind, certainly something I'm keeping in the back of my mind watching this as we move forward. Certainly can't think of a more bullish environment for real assets here over the coming years. So keep that in mind. And if this video brought you any sort of value or entertainment, as always, give me some YouTube juice, thumbs up, and subscribe. Appreciate it. See you next week.